with Senator Robert Menendez of New Jersey. Senator Menendez is the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He and his committee staff have released a report today, which you can find on the committee's website, and the link will be in the chat box on Zoom. And the report is about President Donald Trump's effect on America's global standing. Now, if the Democrats win control of the Senate in the coming year, there's a very good chance that Senator Menendez will become the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, giving him an even bigger microphone. We're going to start with some remarks from the senator, and then I'll be asking him some questions. The senator has a tight schedule, and we may not have time at the very end for audience questions, but don't worry. A number of you have already sent me questions that you want me to ask, and so I'll be incorporating those into my questions. So let's begin. Senator Menendez, the virtual floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Nahal, very much. It's good to see you again. And thank you all for joining us online for this release of the report entitled The Costs of Trump's Foreign Policy, Damaging Consequences for U.S. and Global Security. Let me first explain why I thought undertaking this report was important. Much has been written about President Trump's failed foreign policy, but I thought it was important to assess the damage of the past 4 years from a congressional perspective, and to look at some of the starkest examples of how our president has engaged with the world and what his actions have meant for the American people. My staff interviewed dozens of former U.S. officials, many who served in senior positions in the Trump administration. They traveled and met with foreign government officials and foreign policy experts, speaking to people from more than 20 countries. And what we found was troubling. The consequences of both Donald Trump's words and action have been almost unequivocally negative for the American people and for broader United States interests globally. Nearly 4 years since he took office, we see democratic decline and creeping authoritarianism around the world. We see the North Korea nuclear and missile programs larger and more capable than before. We see Iran inching closer to a nuclear weapon. And instead of building alliances or coming up with a better deal, as he promised, President Trump has alienated our partners and allies. Indeed, this president has repeatedly bullied and threatened our closest friends, when what we need are strong coalitions to promote our interests and address our most pressing challenges. Look no further than the global coronavirus pandemic. Trump isn't leading the global response to this pandemic. He's deliberately undermining it. This administration's unrealistic expectations, lack of attention, and inconsistency have left promising diplomatic initiatives to wither on the vine. The president's attacks on democratic values have empowered autocrats and authoritarians to tighten their grip on power. Former diplomats report not being able to credibly or effectively raise human rights with foreign governments. 4 years in, if you're still searching for the Trump doctrine on foreign policy, you will find a warm embrace of autocratic leaders, a cold shoulder for our closest allies, and a personal agenda that comes at the expense of the values and interests of the American people. The president has championed his policy as an America first approach, but in practice, what we have is a Trump first approach. This report catalogs some of the most damaging aspects of what that means for Americans. First, President Trump's foreign policy has been marked by chaos, neglect, and diplomatic failures. National security decisions have been driven by his ego and domestic political calculations, not the vital interests of the United States. Foreign officials recounted how they don't know who speaks for the president, or whether a new policy announcement is real or will be abruptly reversed. It's no wonder that partners are wary of coordinating with us and making new engagements. His attempts to personally engage on real crises have resulted in diplomatic failure. For example, when it became clear that a quick breakthrough in the nuclear negotiations with North Korea was unrealistic, he lost interest and declared the problem solved. It is not solved. He has neglected pressing global challenges that endanger the American people, including climate change, the COVID-19 pandemic, and nuclear proliferation. Instead of leading international efforts, the Trump administration has undermined them, from withdrawing from the World Health Organization and refusing to participate in global vaccine efforts to abandoning the Paris Climate Agreement. And he has politicized foreign policy by using his office to advance his own electoral interests, openly calling on foreign governments to aid him and work against his opponent. Secondly, President Trump's corrosive domestic policies have damaged U.S. credibility abroad and undermined our ability to promote democratic values globally. He has separated families at the border, turned away refugees, attacked the rule of law, attacked a free press, tear-gassed citizens engaged in peaceful protests, and spouted divisive rhetoric on race. His own statements and policies have implicitly given a green light to repressive regimes around the world. His repeated attacks on the media are cited by foreign leaders in support of their own repressive acts. And according to a former U.S. official, they legitimize the threat environment for journalists. Thirdly, the president's abrupt and inconsistent decision-making has taken close allies by surprise and thrown alliances into disarray. We heard from foreign governments that the fabric of our alliances is frayed. Some are hanging by a thread, and for good reason. We have treated our allies not as trusted partners, but as the kid we can pick on in the schoolyard time and time again just because we can. From declaring Canada a national security threat, to threatening Germany with auto tariffs, to threatening and insulting Mexico, to withdrawing troops from Syria with no advance warning to allies who have security interests there, our friends feel abused and alienated. As a result, some have begun to move on, looking to build alliances that don't have the United States at the table. Fourth, the president's hostility towards multilateral alliances has left the United States withdrawn and isolated from combating pressing global challenges and provided openings to our adversaries. Our go-it-alone approach has meant that when the United States seeks to extend a UN arms embargo against Iran, a bipartisan congressional goal, only the Dominican Republic votes with us, and our close allies vote against us. Not because they don't agree with the objective, but because the U.S. has lost all credibility and trust on the issue. Our increasing absence from multilateral institutions mean that our adversaries, particularly China, have a foothold to gain influence. And while we have a list of grievances with the UN Human Rights Council and the World Health Organization, walking away takes away our ability to effectively counter China and to improve these institutions. And fifth, and perhaps most dangerously, the president's rhetoric and actions have emboldened and empowered authoritarian regimes and autocratic leaders, weakening human rights and undermining democratic values. President Trump has made clear the United States will not push back when authoritarian leaders punish an academic institution, carry out a judicial power grab, or assassinate a US-based journalist. Instead of holding the Saudi government accountable for the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi, he has gone out of his way to repeatedly defend the Saudi crown prince, going so far as to publicly defend him over his own intelligence agencies. Hungary's retreat from democracy and drift towards autocratic rule is not met with condemnation or diplomatic isolation, but rewarded with an Oval Office meeting where Orban is praised as a tough but respected leader. Today, autocrats and authoritarians know that Donald Trump has their back. Now, Americans might wonder, what does this have to do with me? It's true. U.S. foreign policy is often not on the forefront of most Americans' minds, but it remains central to the security and prosperity of the American people. For decades, American leaders pursued a foreign policy vision based upon a robust defense of democratic values. Today, that legacy is hanging precariously in doubt. If the United States is not standing up to brutal regimes, demanding protections for human rights abroad, if it does not counter China's repression in Xinjiang, if it allows attacks on a free press to go unanswered, it erodes all of our rights abroad and at home. And it undermines our authority when we try to demand better of nations. It sends a ripple effect throughout the world. If the United States can do it, so can we. If the US only bullies and threatens, our allies and partners will look elsewhere. If we do not band together, pool our resources, expertise, and might, the United States will be ill-equipped to meet future global challenges. So let me conclude. Where do we go from here? First, we need to rebuild U.S. foreign policy institutions, such as the State Department, which has suffered the loss of extraordinary talent over the past 4 years. Restoring overseas confidence in the United States requires highly qualified diplomats who conduct themselves in a reliable and transparent manner. Second, the United States must mend relations with allies and partners. It won't be easy, but it's absolutely necessary. Alliances are a foundational bedrock for protecting the American people. We need partnerships that pool power and resources in order to counter Russia and China and tackle problems we cannot solve alone. Third, halting the decline of global freedom and democracy must be a critical objective for U.S. foreign policy. Thriving, vibrant democracies around the world improve U.S. safety, security, and prosperity. Fourth, the United States is strongest internationally when we are strong at home. We must address our domestic flaws, including racial discrimination and inequality. The best way to communicate to other nations that they must strive for full equality is to embody it ourselves. This report is the beginning of a conversation about the future of U.S. foreign policy and how to undo the damage wrought by this president. I hope it can serve as a roadmap for Congress and a future administration about what needs rebuilding and where the damage lies, and as a reminder of the consequence of incoherent, chaotic foreign policy. For those of us who care deeply about this country and the role that we play in the world, there is a lot of work ahead. So thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Senator. I really appreciate those remarks. I have a bunch of questions for you, and so I'm hoping we can tackle all of them. Your report was very interesting, but I was particularly struck by a section you had about accountability. You said that the Trump administration needs to be held accountable for some of its actions that you have deemed negative. Now, but you were somewhat vague about that in the report. So my question to you is, which alleged misdeeds do you want to hold the administration accountable for, especially if you become the chairman? And what exactly would accountability look like?
Yeah, well, Nahal, look, the accountability that I'm talking about is an assessment. We've tried to lay a foundational element of that in this report of where this Trump administration has left us in the world. So in knowing that assessment and knowing where the shortcomings are and where the consequences have been, then we can begin to build upon it. For example, what's happened at the State Department. We've conducted a series of investigations and requested IG reviews about some of the politicalization at the State Department. We need a robust, vibrant State Department with very capable people to promote American values around the world. In the arms sales process, we need to make sure that Congress's role is well respected and engaged. And that is something this administration has sought to trample upon. So an accounting in that respect is understanding where this administration has taken us down the wrong path, the consequences that flow from it, and then how do we correct it?
But I mean, look, we recently just had stories about how there's 545 children who don't, are still separated from their parents. And I guess what I want to know is when it comes to situations like that, these are migrant kids and others, or say the politicization of the State Department. It's one thing to say, well, we don't want to do these terrible things again. We just want to move forward and do better. But what about the people who separated those kids from their parents? What about the individuals who retaliated against career officers at the State Department? Those types of things. Are they individually going to be held accountable or not? I mean, what are you going to do on that front?
Well, look, I don't see the committee acting as the investigative authority on all of these issues. And I think there's so much work to do that lies ahead to promote the safety, security, and prosperity of the American people. When it is appropriate, and it comes about in terms of information, and if there are still those in positions of power who conducted themselves inappropriately, who created some of the consequences of the separation of children who have no parent linkage at this point, who did some of these other things, then of course, that will be either referred to an inspector general, or we may look at it specifically. But my view that the committee's work is to help us build a robust foreign policy that makes America more secure, more prosperous at the end of the day. And that would be the priority that I hope we would take.
But you do have the power, frankly, to name and shame if necessary, right? Is that something at the very least that the committee can do, and issue reports, that sort of thing? I mean, say, look.
Well, I haven't hesitated to do that as a ranking member. I certainly wouldn't hesitate to do it as a chairman if I had that opportunity.
Okay. All right. So my second question is one that about 20 people have asked me to ask you. Okay. Democrats have been fairly united in their opposition to Trump's policy toward Iran, especially his decision to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal. You opposed the Iran nuclear deal back in 2015. I covered it. You were very vocal. But Joe Biden wants to rejoin the deal. If he does become president, does he have your support in that move?
Well, look, I think that a President Biden will also face the realities that the Iran nuclear deal and the sunset questions are closer to an issue today than they were when the deal was entered into. The reality is that any administration that comes forward was going to face the realities of Iran having gotten closer in its development, that having tested more ballistic missiles and perfected it, that still has its malign activities. So I often refer to this as JCPOA plus, because the reality is that we will need more than the JCPOA at the end of the deal. As a matter of fact, the error, the big mistake, the consequence, even as somebody who opposed the JCPOA, has said that the consequence of leaving unilaterally by the Trump administration without any effort in internationalizing our efforts was a huge mistake. Even the French were talking to us about going beyond what the JCPOA was, recognizing its shortfalls on the sunset questions, and also dealing with a continuing arms embargo, with missile proliferation, and with other elements. We missed out on that opportunity. So I believe that I'm sure that Vice President Biden, should he become president, will want to deal with the totality of all of those issues. And that to me suggests a JCPOA plus.
So you would support a quote unquote better deal, not necessarily going back to the old deal?
Well, as Senator Graham and I actually offered a idea of, and we talked to some of our European allies and others about it, about going back to the JCPOA, but with a framework understanding that Iran would engage in other elements, critical issues that have to be dealt with, like their weapons development, like their ballistic missile development, like their proliferation, continuing of terrorism, as part of a more holistic deal, for which, of course, the more we get, the more we give. And so the reality is that at the beginning was, okay, we go back to the JCPOA, but with an understanding there is more to be built with.
But you realize that you're sort of perhaps making the perfect the enemy of the good here, right? I mean, in pushing for this idea of a JCPOA plus, you're kind of hoping that the Iranians will come along, that sort of thing. And ultimately, at the end of the day, there might not be a deal at all. And Iran will continue to get closer to having a nuclear weapon. I mean, you realize this, right?
I realize that even our closest allies, those who were close with us at this time, understand that there is a need to build upon the JCPOA, but not to believe that the JCPOA is the beginning and the end of what needs to be done. The reality is that there is a lot more. And as I mentioned, even the French were very much engaged in seeking to pursue a lot more when we were in the deal. And so the deal, anyone who believes that just going back to the JCPOA, including some of my strongest colleagues here who supported the JCPOA, recognize that more has to be done than just the JCPOA.
Thank you. I mean, I understand your point. And sticking to the Middle East, you have criticized Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates for their conduct in the brutal Yemen war. a war that doesn't get nearly the attention that it deserves. Now, the Biden campaign has talked about restricting US arms sales to the Saudis and Emiratis. But I have to tell you, I'm a bit skeptical that they will follow through on this for a number of reasons. Should I be skeptical? And if they don't follow through on restricting these arms sales, what are you prepared to do about it?
Well, I do think, I do believe when Vice President Biden says that they would restrict arms sales. They would restrict arms sales to ensure a result. If they were in diplomatic engagement with these countries to get them to stop what is happening in their engagements in these parts of the Middle East, then that might not result in eliminating arms sales. But otherwise, I do believe they will follow through on it. And the reality is there is very strong support, certainly on the Democratic caucus, as is exhibited by the votes that I led on, defying the administration of the Saudi arms deals, and even the UAE at one point, which is a much better partner than certainly the Saudis have been. But there is a strong appetite among the Democratic caucus to see that through. And I believe that without President Trump, there would be several Republicans who would join us in that effort. So I do take the Biden view that they will follow through on it.
Well, let me tell you one reason that I'm a bit skeptical that the U.S. is going to come down hard on the Saudis and the Emiratis. And that's probably because there's some positive developments with them, especially when it comes to their warming ties with Israel, one of our strongest partners in the region, our most important partners in the region. And the dynamics of the region seem to be changing. In fact, you're hearing that, even in Saudi Arabia, there's much fewer restrictions on socializing and things like that. Women are now allowed to drive. There are some positive development. So how do you ensure that that sort of momentum continues while also holding these countries accountable for their military and human rights related violations in places like Yemen and beyond? How do you find that balance?
Well, look, we applaud the UAE's recognition and relationship with Israel and Bahrain's. We applaud in Saudi Arabia the greater openings within civil society, especially for women. That's all good. We also have something called U.S. law, which says that Israel must maintain its qualitative military edge in the region. So as we're looking at these new relationships, we also have an obligation to U.S. law. And so I just get concerned that we see a breakneck speed of sales, for example, being proposed to the UAE without the appropriate deliberative process that goes through from the State Department, the Department of Defense, and with our allies to understand the consequences of such sales. So it seems to me that this should be, peace and normalization, but not peace and normalization for weapons at the end of the day. So we can have a robust relationship. We can develop a security architecture that can include these countries, but U.S. law says that the qualitative military edge of Israel needs to be preserved.
Right. But I mean, my question was more about, how do you hold these countries accountable for their activities in places like Yemen, while at the same time not wanting them to walk away from these positive developments? I mean, how do you, what is something you would do to try to, make sure that they get both of these messages, that we want the positive stuff and not so much the negative stuff?
Yeah. Well, listen, that first starts off with the President of the United States, who makes it very clear that assassinating a journalist is not acceptable in our relationship, that our relationships don't go, are, totally okay for so long as you do certain things, then you can do anything you want. That's the message that President Trump has sent. And so it starts with a president who upholds basic democratic principles, who insists in our relationships that people move towards a greater acceptance of it, countries move toward a greater acceptance of it, that leaders, do not ultimately undermine a free press and dissent when it is peaceful. And that starts with the president. And then it's followed by a Congress that I would hope that in its legislations would promote that as a principle, be prepared to provide a benefit for those who actually follow those fundamental views of democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and that creates consequences for those who don't.
Yeah, I guess, a lot of it, people say things all the time in Washington. People put out press releases and talk. I think it just comes down to what actual, the devil in the details of what you're actually prepared to do. But anyway, moving on, although feel free to address that as well. But staying in the region, because we can't escape the Middle East. If Benjamin Netanyahu were with us right now, what advice would you give him on how he should approach a President Biden?
Well, I think that
Unvarnished advice.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think he needs to understand that the U.S.-Israel relationship has been rooted in strong bipartisan support because of our mutual interests. And he needs to understand that it is not good for Israel and certainly not good for our relationship to root it in a partisan view, number one. Number two is that I think that moving forward with any forms of annexation is a real consequence in terms of U.S. policy. I think that, while they have now said that they have suspended, I think that term suspended needs to be pursued and understood. What does suspend mean with the UAE's recognition of Israel? We need to work on making sure that that suspension is not a temporal thing. And lastly, I would make it very clear to the Prime Minister that we rejoice in Israel not only being a Jewish state, but being a democratic state. And Israel cannot be Jewish and democratic if, in fact, it is a one-state solution. It needs to be a two-state solution for those two elements of Jewish identity to continue to be a reality. And so those are some of the things that I'd have Vice President Biden say as president.
So just to be clear, like, you want to make sure that annexation is permanently suspended, this idea of annexation of the disputed territories claimed by Palestinians.
Yeah, I think that if you pursue annexation, then you are eroding the possibility of a two-state solution. And what we must be robustly engaged in is going back to the drawing board, especially in the changing, evolving relationship that is taking place in the Middle East with Israel, that we may have a new dynamic as to, how the Palestinian Authority deals with getting to a two-state solution. So you have to preserve that possibility. I think it's almost impossible to preserve if you continue on with annexation.
I wish Mr. Netanyahu was here. It'd be interesting to see what he would say. We're going to actually go somewhere else in the world now. You did not also support the Obama administration's opening to Cuba. And President Trump he's largely reversed that opening. I mean, to a degree that was even less open than before when Obama took over. Are you okay with this continual squeezing of Havana? Do you think that Biden should continue pushing this? Or if there is a President Biden and he wants to have an opening to Cuba again, go back to a more normal relationship, would you support that?
Well, look, as always, it depends upon how things are done. I think one of the things that we learned about the normalization was that the regime took full advantage of it. It did not reciprocate in any way. It did not release political prisoners. It did not permit for a more open civil society and dissent, peaceful dissent. It did not certainly permit any openings of a free press. It didn't do any of the things that one would aspire to see Cuba do. And so, if you want to engage with Cuba, there can be conditionality, right? You can still engage, but have conditionality. For example, when we had apartheid in South Africa, we had the Sullivan Principles, which basically meant that an American company doing business in South Africa had to be able to hire directly workers, pay them directly and empower them directly, and this way would not discriminate against Black South Africans. The reality is that would be a powerful tool to say an American company doing business in Cuba has to hire workers directly, because workers can't be hired directly by any foreign entity. They're hired, you go to the government sends you an employee, you pay the government a robust wage, they give the employee a fraction of their wages, and you fire them at will because there's no labor rights. So that's an example of creating relationships with conditionality. There could be a call for the release of political prisoners. So I think that Vice President Biden would having experienced both ends of the spectrum of U.S.-Cuba policy, could find his own pathway to make it more constructive and more possible.
So it sounds to me, though, like you would offer potential support for a restoration of relations depending on the situation. I mean, it sounds like a softer position that I recall you.
I would certainly look at what President Biden would be considering in terms of such openings, but under what conditions.
Fair. So China, where do I begin? Your report, was talked a bit about China and the importance of dealing with that relationship, and especially the ways, the mixed messages that President Trump has sent on China. If you are chairman, and even if you're not, you have a big microphone on what to do with Beijing and the Chinese Communist Party. What will be your top priority when it comes to that particular issue?
Well, Nahal, I would direct you and our viewers to the legislation we put out, America Leads Act. It is all encompassing. It took all of the committee jurisdictions that have something to do with China. So Finance Committee on trade questions, of course, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on diplomacy and other elements, the Appropriations Committee in terms of what we need to do to not only confront China, but to compete with China. And this is something I think the report drove very strongly. We need not only to confront China, for example, in its violation of human rights, what it is doing in the South China Sea, by way of example, but we must compete against it, because if you want to tell allies don't use Huawei because its 5G infrastructure can undermine your national security interests, you've got to offer something in return. That's one simple example. So we must compete with China. We must join in alliances that help us compete with countries that need assistance and pool our resources so that we can ultimately help some of these countries, and then instead of them becoming dependent upon China in a way that is, perverse in terms of that country's interests. So this report talked about how do we deal with trade issues, how do we deal with democracy and human rights, how do we deal with competing with China, and I think it's very comprehensive, very well thought out, and that would be our blueprint as it relates to China.
Now, would you recommend, though, that President Biden continue with, add to, or keep some of the sanctions that President Trump and restrictions President Trump has put on China? And I'm not necessarily talking about tariffs, but I'm talking about, for instance, limiting the number of visas that Chinese students can get, shutting down Confucius Institute, labeling media organizations as state propaganda outlets, that sort of thing. I'm just wondering, do you support that kind of punishment-heavy approach, and do you think President Biden should continue that, as well as trying to make America more competitive?
Well, look, I would think that a President Biden would want to chart his own way with China and Xi Jinping. And in charting that way forward, I think he'll understand that we not only need to confront China, we need to compete with it. That means some of the things when he talks about Build Back Better at home are critical at home for us to be able to compete with China abroad. And I think that as he develops his own way with Xi Jinping in China, he may have use of both carrots and sticks. So some of those things he may find appropriate in the absence of Chinese response to his initiatives and overtures to them. And others he may feel that may be a way to incentivize to have them travel a different path, at least to see whether they're responsive to it. So, I wouldn't say carte blanche, these are all good, these are all bad. They're just a question of, as a new administration engages China and engages our allies, this is a huge part. It's not just us vis-a-vis bilaterally with China. It is engaging our allies in the region and beyond to deal with China. China challenges us in every single way, politically, economically, militarily, even in some respects, culturally, as they try to influence. They want to change the world order from that which was made after World War II in a way that is actually very concerning because of the authoritarianism. We put out a report on digital authoritarianism, for example. So part of this is engaging the world to help us engage and deal with China and both confront it and compete with it.
Okay. So my next question is about Venezuela. And I really tried hard to craft like a smart question about it, but honestly, it just seems like a giant mess. And so I'm just going to ask you, Venezuela, what's to be done?
Yeah. Well, look, this is one of the few places that I do say that at the beginning, the Trump administration did some good things. It got 50 major countries in the world to recognize Juan Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela under the Venezuelan Constitution as the head of the National Assembly. It started doing some correct sanctioning. What it failed to do, the biggest sanction that Maduro could have received is to be called illicit by 50 countries, including the leading countries of Europe and others in the world. But he failed to bring that coalition together to bear in all of the elements of the policy we needed to get a diplomatic solution in Venezuela. So it failed to internationalize beyond the recognition, for example, having sanctions directly focused on Maduro and his cronies in a way that would send a message to Maduro, either make a deal, because if you don't, there's nowhere to go in the world. And that failure, another example of not willing to multilateralize our efforts, I think is glaring as it relates to Venezuela. And then we don't even show up at donor conferences or we lower tier, something I had been advocating for some time, because we have spent nearly $1 billion in humanitarian assistance to help countries like Colombia, have been great neighbors to Venezuelans, and over 5 million Venezuelans that have left. But the reality is there's a lot more to be done in that regard. And when you say we don't take refugees at home, it's tough to tell other countries, go ahead and take a refugee.
Should President Biden continue to recognize Juan Guaido? And should he continue to build on what President Trump leaves behind? Or should there be a wholesale rethinking of the policy?
I think that he should recognize Juan Guaido as the continuing interim president of Venezuela. I hope a new administration would also say, as the Congress is saying, that these upcoming legislative elections are a farce and illegitimate. It's another attempt by Maduro to smash the last vestige of some degree of democracy inside of Venezuela. But then to harness our allies in a goal towards a diplomatic solution in Venezuela.
Okay, now coming back to Capitol Hill, it's quite possible that you will have a number of new colleagues in the next term, and it seems like the progressive voice on Capitol Hill is going to be growing a fair amount. Now, I've talked to a lot of progressives in recent weeks, and they're not your biggest fans, but they seem poised to have a lot of plans to say a lot of things in the coming months and years. How do you plan to deal with some of their demands and advice? They're not always going to be agreeing with you. So how do you expect you'll deal with that?
Well, first of all, I have been in public service long enough to know that we're not always going to get everybody to agree with us. We have a strong coalition on the Democratic side of the aisle in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which includes several very strong progressives. We have fashioned legislation that has actually had not only their voices, but their initiatives included. And so I think that's we will continue to build upon that. The other reality is that when it comes to foreign policy, particularly foreign policy, we are stronger as a nation when we can have, when it's possible, a bipartisan chorus of voices saying this is the United States stand, so that our allies also understand that it won't shift from administration to administration. That may not always be possible, but that is certainly, particularly in foreign policy, desirable. And so there are some, on the committee, more moderate voices that could be worked with in common goal. Certainly, I could point to a whole host of initiatives that I have sponsored that are very progressive, but of course, sometimes my friends in the progressive community, unless it's 100%, it's not acceptable. So, we will continue to engage with everybody, including our progressive friends, and those voices will be heard on the committee, very strongly, as they have been over the last 2 years.
Well, some progressive groups have asked Joe Biden to cut $200 billion from the Pentagon's budget. Do you support that?
I have to see how we're going to cut it, where we're going to cut it from, what we're going to use it for. Those things in the abstract are very nice, but where's the 200 billion going for? What is it coming out of? I never have never supported in Congress, just wholesale cuts without knowing all the other elements of it. So whether that's across the board cuts, which I have opposed, or specific cuts that ultimately, unless I know, well, where are you taking it from? How does that not undermine national security? Where is it going to? For what purposes? Are those purposes that I agree to? Are those of greater value than wherever you're doing in the defense budget?
Okay, well, we're almost out of time, but I do have a couple more things. What advice would you give to the Biden transition team if they want to see their nominees move through the Senate confirmation process quickly, especially if Republicans keep a hold of the chamber? Should they nominate someone like Susan Rice?
I will let the president, President Biden, choose who he seeks to nominate for all these critical positions. What I would say in a more broader term is that, look, send us quality people. One of the things that have been abhorrent under the Trump administration is that we have had nominees that are woefully incapable of performing the duties that they were nominated for, or inconsistent with the very mission that they were nominated for. And people who had deeply flawed backgrounds that should have never been nominated in the first place. I don't expect that from a Biden administration. On the contrary, the one thing about Joe Biden is he did foreign policy for a long time. He did it as a United States senator. He did it as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, which is why I believe he'll have a great deal of respect for the committee and for the Senate. He did it as vice president of the United States. This is a totally different person than Donald Trump. He will restore our standing in the world, build our alliances, and rebuild institutions like the State Department. So give us quality people, and I think quality people will withstand whatever onslaught that any partisan attempt is going to bring.
But do you still expect an onslaught, even if they do send very high quality people? I mean, do you expect Republicans to nonetheless?
It depends. It depends if Republicans want to continue in the Donald Trump mode, or they want to go back to the Republican Party that was fiscally conservative, socially moderate, and and try to find common ground, particularly on foreign policy, to put the interests of the United States best foot forward. I don't know which Republican Party is going to show up after Election Day. We'll see.
You have friends in the GOP. What do they tell you about what they hope will happen?
Oh, I think that, well, if you see lately, all of a sudden, we have a public distancing of Republican senators from the president. For a long time, privately, they would grumble about much of the president's actions, including in foreign policy, Turkey being a big example of that. But they have never been willing to publicly challenge the president. And this is something that I've often said to them. I'm an institutionalist. You talked about two different items that I disagreed with President Obama on. I don't believe that whether it be a Republican chairman or a Democratic chairman, the role of Congress is to rubber stamp everything an administration does. I believe that you work with an administration, whether it's of your party or not, when they're right and when it is in the national interest to do so. And I believe you stand up to it when they're wrong or when there is a strongly held different view. If not, then what is the purpose of the Article 1 provision of the Constitution, which is the Congress of the United States?
Well, that was my reminder that we're almost out of time. I'm going to end this with an appeal to you, sir. if there is any possibility that you could change the rules so that during hearings, senators are only allowed to ask questions instead of pontificating on and on, I think there are a lot of people in all of humanity who would be really grateful for that. Is it possible that you could do that?
Well, I'm loath to undermine the prerogatives of any senator. I will just simply say that I certainly would inure to their best instincts that that would be the greatest desirable. We will get more truth. We'll get to the truth of the matter, or the substance of the matter, understanding. For me, questioning has always been to get to the heart of what is not only the truth on a given matter, but what is our best path forward to get the best out of people's thinking and the intellect that we have before us. I don't know that a rules change can actually make that happen or that it would pass, but certainly we would try to cajole our colleagues to use their time to question, pursue the truth, and get the facts, and be able to get the best knowledge of the great minds we have in this country willing to share it with the committee.
Well, I can certainly support a pursuit of truth. I always do that. So thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us. We really appreciate this. And let's do this again sometime.
All right. Thank you so much.